Thank you, Paul. I should be introducing you. 16 Pulitzer Prizes and counting. You are an inspiration to all of us. And thank you to the FPA. I am grateful for this recognition, and congratulations to Sir Martin as well. Presumably a pure coincidence, but we are immediate neighbors. And Noel, we can introduce you to the nice people on the 7th floor for next year's dinner. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about the future of the news and the crisis in journalism, which many of you are aware of. It is a tough time to be a journalist. Nobody ever went into journalism for the money, but at least they could count on a job. And as some of you might know, in the last 15 years, the number of working journalists in the United States has fallen by 50%. 50%. And the same pattern you see elsewhere in the world. So why is this happening? First, the business model that was the source of some of the great fortunes in the pre-digital era is broken and it's not coming back. And that's because many of the reasons that readers paid for newspapers, so weather and stock prices and sports scores and job postings and yes, news, are available today, as we all know, instantaneously and more comprehensively on the web. And subscriptions never covered the true cost of the journalism, but that was okay because the classified ads did. But the internet unbundled all of this, and that era is over. 75% of incremental ad dollars flow to Google and Facebook today. And the internet has conditioned readers to believe that news should be free. So publishers are belatedly trying to put up paywalls. As many of you know, the New York Times has been successful, but that is the exception, not the rule. And for most news organizations, it is way too late. One of the best bargains over the web over the last decade has been free news. But like many other apparently free lunches, it has come at a cost. And that cost has been the deterioration of investigative journalism that helps protect all of us from abuse of power. When we don't pay for news, we are all poorer as a society. So the news industry has been in denial for a long time. And in my experience as a lapsed journalist and as a media and technology investor for 25 years, I've seen many very smart people trying to find a business answer. And I think we all need to accept that there is no fundamental solution coming anytime soon. And as a consequence, journalism has been hollowed out. And it's a bit hard to see it happening in real time because it happens slowly. And you all know the boiling frog phenomenon. A frog placed in boiling water instantly leaps out on contact with the water, but a frog placed in room temperature water will remain complacently in the pot until it's cooked. And that is what has happened to news. So first, a paper might close a foreign bureau, then it closes the State House Bureau, and then it cut the carefully reported story on municipal corruption. And the absence of that story has everything to do with the absence of reporters and absolutely nothing to do with the sudden reduction in corruption. Because of course, human nature doesn't change. And it's psychologically very hard for readers to notice the story that isn't there. So if you're a journalist and you're one of the lucky ones that has a job, you know why the story isn't there. The remaining skeleton crews of beat reporters are scrambling to file their daily news stories. Sometimes the job calls for you to post literally every hour. For those of you who know journalists, you know this is part of the routine. And so there are very few journalists left that have the luxury to spend days or weeks or months on investigative stories. And that's a problem because a successful democracy requires the press to be a watchdog even if there is no commercial model for it. In the digital era, we have more content than ever, but precious little original reporting. Most of the content that we see on the web and on our phones is derivative. It's commentary. It's not reporting done by professional journalists adhering to standards of evidence and sourcing. And unless you're paying attention, it is really easy to miss that. There are some exceptions to what I'm saying. So in India, for example, print newspapers remain strong, although with Jio's dramatic launch of cheap mobile access for hundreds of millions of Indians, my guess is that Indian news outlets also will begin to suffer. And the second big culprit here behind the crisis in journalism is social media. So more than 40% of Americans get some or all of their news from Facebook, 40%. And that might be okay if Facebook took its role seriously, but Facebook does not view itself as a media company. And unlike traditional news organizations, which are run by human editors, making thousands of judgments every day, however imperfect, Facebook has no editor. Story selection is determined by an algorithm. And the algorithm is also making judgments, in this case, every millisecond. But the algorithms are solving for engagement, i.e. page views. And more views, as we know, means more advertising. And that has a number of bad social consequences. So first, there's no front page. The algorithm equates the trivial with the profound. The Kardashian gets equal prominence to the Rohingya, literally. And that's probably not even right, because algorithms favor engagement, and Google Trends says there are at least 100 times more Kardashian searches than Rohingya searches. Second, from an engagement standpoint, the weekend activities of your friends, from the standpoint of Facebook, are more interesting than the atrocities of the Syrian civil war. And so Facebook is systematically decreasing the amount of news that it is presenting in our news feeds. Less Syria and more friends. This is happening now. And third, as we all know from the 2016 election, until very recently, social media didn't consider vetting news sources to be part of its job. So in an algorithmic world, the click becomes the source of authority, which means the most clickable content is the content that gets presented the most. As recently as a year ago, a benign-sounding network called RT was just about equal to CNN in viewership on YouTube, which is owned by Google. 20% of Americans, by the way, get at least some of their news from YouTube, which is pretty astonishing. Do you know what RT is? RT actually stands for Russian television. They just changed the name. RT is also a significant source of video that is inciting yellow vest protesters in France. And finally, the news cycle is so short that stories flicker across the consciousness and then they're gone. There is no follow-up. And a story with no follow-up is a dead story. And bad actors know that they can write out a bad story because Facebook isn't going to be asking any questions. The algorithm doesn't ask questions. And let me concede that for the last 100 years, people have worried that each new media technology wave, radio in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, cable television in the 1980s, would lead to degeneracy and doom of one sort or another. The English author Douglas Adams, who had the distinction apparently of being the first person to buy a Mac in Europe, said, "Your enthusiasm for new technology depends on how old you are. Technology that existed when we were born seems normal. Anything that was developed before we turned 35 is exciting. And whatever comes after that is treated with suspicion." And I will readily admit, Paul told you my age, to falling into my appointed role, I am suspicious. The most downloaded app in the world right now is on the Apple App Store is called TikTok, which is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. How many of you all have heard of TikTok? A fair number. Maybe you use TikTok. It aggregates video clips done by ordinary people, a lot of them teenagers, maybe you're teenagers, which last a few seconds. So for example, a popular recent meme was a microwave challenge in which people filmed themselves rotating very slowly in a circle like food on a microwave tray. This company that I just mentioned, ByteDance, has a valuation of $75 billion. So I am concerned. The third reason that journalism is in crisis is our leaders. There is always, and everybody in this room knows this, there's always a healthy level of adversarialism between journalists and the administrations they cover. But lately it's become much more dangerous. So public officials now routinely vilify journalists. It's become much more acceptable to attack journalists, sometimes verbally and sometimes physically. So last year, as we all know, Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post journalist who was critical of the Saudi regime, was murdered. What attracted less notice is that at least 16 other journalists, also critical of the Saudi regime, remain in jail, and at least 4 of them have been tortured. It has also escaped notice that the Erdogan regime, which expressed moral outrage at the treatment of Khashoggi, is itself, ironically, one of the most repressive in the world, having banned more than 100 news organizations and having jailed more journalists than any other country in the world. So worldwide, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which, by the way, take a look at their work, it's really excellent, tracks these things and counts 251 journalists imprisoned last year, of which Turkey and China and Egypt account for more than half. And 16 journalists have been killed so far in 2019, many of them targeted for their work. In the United States, where free press is one of the fundamental elements of our country, since assuming office, the president has repeatedly disparaged journalists and has tweeted the phrase fake news 600 times. And it's catchy. As Arthur Sulzberger has pointed out, more than 50 prime ministers and other government officials outside the US have now also used the phrase fake news to disparage the press. The Philippines, for example, is one of the most hostile countries in the world to journalists. Duterte has explicitly said that journalists are legitimate targets of assassination. Some of you may know of Maria Ressa, who's the editor of a Philippine publication called Rappler, which has been targeted by the regime for its critical stories. So, for example, a story that carefully documented Duterte's manipulation of Facebook using bots and fake accounts in a country where Facebook is essentially the internet. And she was arrested in March as she got off a San Francisco to Manila flight charged with tax fraud. This is also a problem right here. Less than a year ago, a gunman walked into the offices of the Capital Gazette in Annapolis, Maryland, and killed 4 journalists. The next day, the president said, quote, "Journalists, like all Americans, should be free from the fear of being violently attacked while doing their job." But a few days later, he was back on Twitter calling journalists, quote, "enemies of the people." And that same phrase, as many of you probably know, was used by Stalin in the 1930s. Unfortunately, leaders use this strategy because it works. 48% of Republicans in the United States in one poll last year agreed with the idea that, quote, "the news media is the enemy of the American people." Trust of the media does vary depending on where you are. If you lived in Northern Europe, the Nordics, Holland, and Germany, trust for media is actually quite high, and same for sub-Saharan Africa. But if you live in Latin America, France, or Italy, trust is actually quite low. In Italy, only 29% of people trust the news media, and of those, only 3% trust the media a lot. So what do we do about this? I will attempt a partial answer, and my answer, as Paul alluded to, at least to the collapse of the traditional media model, is not-for-profit journalism. So I'm involved with ProPublica, which was founded 12 years ago by a group of highly respected Wall Street Journal and New York Times reporters and editors, led at the time by Paul. And together they've built what is now the largest nonprofit newsroom in the United States, 100 journalists, to cover stories that are in the public interest. ProPublica is nonpartisan, and its mission is to hold power to account. As a nonprofit, it has no business model. There are no ads, there's no paywall, and that's okay because watchdog journalism is a public good. That's how we should think about it. And unlike print, where 80% of the budget went to expenses outside the newsroom, ProPublica spends 80% of its budget on journalism. Some of the stories that ProPublica has published are remarkable, including last year a leaked audio tape of family border separations that was played in the White House press room on the Senate floor, and within a week led to a reversal of the policy. ProPublica recently started looking at American tax filing and discovered that while free tax filing software is available to consumers, only 2% of Americans use it. So why is that? Because TurboTax and its competitors have actively inserted a line of code into the free filing software that instructed Google not to crawl it. So instead, if you Google free tax filing software, you were presented with software that turned out not to be free. No one in the for-profit press wrote about this, and only ProPublica did. So let me conclude by saying a couple of things. There's much less funding for nonprofit news outside the US right now, and one of the great and increasingly urgent opportunities is for funders outside the US to understand that journalism is a public good and that its business model is in crisis, and that nonprofit journalism is okay. We need a free press to hold power to account. One of the things that we take for granted in this country is how little corruption we have compared to other countries. And I think a big reason for that is an aggressive press. One of my favorite comments comes from the American statesman Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, "If the newspapers of a country are filled with good news, jails will be filled with good people." Journalists deserve your support It's hard to be a journalist today, but it's never been more important. Thank you guys very much.